I unfortunately made the mistake of opening Twitter for the first time in months, and then I saw the discourse that was going on about how Varka was acting in the most recent Mondstadt event. Now I know opening Twitter itself was already a mistake. What was I expecting, right? But aside from that, I feel like over the years, there's been this discourse that comes and goes about characters who are flawed. To this day, I still receive comments in my very first video about how some players will always hate A, which is very interesting to me because what motivated me to even like make a YouTube channel was to talk about stuff like this and how certain characters are so much more complicated but just have very poor execution in the story like A, hence why that video exists. And I just find it so interesting that that discourse is still ongoing, just with different characters. I think most people are okay with A now. So the entire thing got me thinking, do we really want flawed characters? Do we as modern players want characters who are actually unlikable? We often hear the answer to those questions as a very big yes, but once a character starts showing flaws, there are plenty of people who will demonize said character and refuse to see past their flaws, which defeats the purpose. And when a character has very little flaws, people are also angry about that. So with that being said, there are several things that I would like to talk about today. The first being, what actually makes a good flawed character? Parentheses, my opinion. I would define a good flawed character as a character who is capable of making mistakes, and those mistakes in turn affect the story and even other characters. So an example in Genshin is Venti. His biggest number one flaw is actually his own idea of freedom. He doesn't want to govern Mondstadt directly, but this does come at a price for his people. Yes, they're no longer oppressed by a god like the Caribbean, but it has also led to a different kind of oppression under the Lawrence clan for a time. And another price that the people of Mondstadt had to pay was also just Barbados not being able to show up fully sometimes. For example, like during the Cataclysm, yes, Venti was there eventually to save the people of Mondstadt, especially when Durin came to attack, but because of his own limitations, he has indirectly caused harm to his own people. It is not fully his fault. I'm not saying like he's a bad Archon or anything, and it definitely wasn't his intention, but because of his ideals and decisions, characters like the Bloodstained Knight and then Rosalind have, as you probably know, suffered greatly. This doesn't make Venti a villain by any means or even an evil character, but it does make him a flawed character. His decisions and mistakes have had consequences that echoed for centuries and throughout the story. And apparently across Tevat, Rosalind, consumed by grief as she lost her lover in the Cataclysm, ended up as the Crimson Witch of Flames and then ended up as one of the Fatui Harbingers, which we all know how that turned out. So Venti's ideals that in turn caused him to make decisions that are flawed has had impact in multiple different characters, in multiple different events, and most importantly, on the narrative of the story. Also, I would like to point out that Venti's flaw in being almost negligent towards his own nation didn't come from nowhere. His ideals of freedom is a direct contrast to Dick Arabian's own ideals as a god and how he was a tyrannical figure for the people of Mondstadt until he was defeated. Venti, as a wind spirit, was present in that fight against Dick Arabian alongside his friend, the Nameless Bard, and this war against Dick Arabian, this experience has shaped Venti as a character so much. It has shaped his ideals, and it has even shaped how he looks because he is still using the form of the Nameless Bard. So his very hands-off approach isn't just some random quirk that he has as an Archon. It actually stems from his own experiences even thousands of years ago as a wind spirit. Therefore, this character flaw isn't given to Venti just for the sake of a joke or gag. It is actually a flaw that he has because of what he went through, and it is very well established within the story. It's part of his story quest. It is everywhere in Mondstadt lore, and that is why I'm using him as an example of a character that has good flaws. Good in a sense that it actually does something for multiple characters, the character itself, and also the story, and even world building. And Venti just is the easiest example that I can think of right now. I think most of the Archons do have good flaws because they are usually the most established characters in the game. I also think that in order for a flaw to be truly impactful for the characters and to the narrative, there has to be consequences in having those flaws. I'm gonna use A for this example because the way that she was overtaken by grief and how she dealt with it was actually a good example for a good flaw for a character to have, in my opinion. People have dunked on A for being awful in the Inazuma Archon quest, but I do think that her arc is actually a good example of a good character flaw in the way that it had massive repercussions all over Inazuma. So A losing her twin sister is obviously not her fault, but her inability to process that grief and the decisions that come after that loss is the character flaw for her specifically. As we all know, her grief has led A to isolate herself in the plane of euthymia and leaving the Shogun puppet in charge. This decision directly caused the Vision Hunt decree and a lot of suffering for the people of Inazuma. Yes, the Fatui had a hand in orchestrating the whole thing, but A was very much aware of what the puppet was doing the entire time. This grief also led to A experimenting with artificial life, hence why we have the Shogun puppet in the first place. But other than the Shogun puppet, this led to the creation of Scaramouche. The initial goal of the creation of Scaramouche is for A to find a way to store the electronosis, and when she saw that Scaramouche had too much emotions for the task, she changed her mind and left him to sleep in the Shake Pavilion. Another character flaw that's shown here is A's emotional neglect. Not because she purposely told Scaramouche to go fuck himself now that he has no use for her, but the flaw itself lies in A's own limited emotional capacity. During this time, she was still overtaken by her grief. She was focused on preserving eternity, which in her mind, if Inazuma remains stasis, then there will be no more losses. So she was like in no way capable of even understanding what her actions would eventually lead to. The character flaw and emotional immaturity caused Scaramouche to see this incident as abandonment, or as he would call it, the first betrayal, which then led him down a long path of his own mistakes. Scaramouche, or the Wanderer, is also a heavily flawed character. He has made choices that directly inflict pain onto others. He has garnered a lot of hatred for humanity and has shown very little regard for human life after all of the betrayals that he experienced. For a while, his character flaw is just genuinely making decisions that are harmful and evil because of his own pain. What's interesting about both A and Scaramouche is how the game slowly tried to redeem them as characters. I have said this before in other videos, but they definitely handled Scaramouche's redemption arc much better than A's, at least in the beginning. I feel like they tried to speedrun A's growth and redemption so she would be good to go on her banner by the time 2.0, was it 2.1 dropped? Her launch banner. But Scaramouche's arc in becoming the Wanderer is really the blueprint of what I think is a good exploration of a character's flaw and how it can expand into their overarching character arc, at least in Genshin. I'm not saying it's perfect, but I still think it's pretty damn good. Even now, as the Wanderer who has gone through major changes throughout the story, man was the side villain for a while, and then the main villain, and then he had an entire interlude quest establishing his backstory, random events where he was part of the academia, and even after all that, when we get to Non-Cry, he still has the impulse to get his revenge on Dottore. His character flaw has moved from actively harming others to being unable to move on from the same cycle of pain and revenge that has led him down towards a very dark path. Just like when he demolished the Raiden Gokaden. But this time, in the end, he made the decision to save the Traveler from Dottore despite knowing that it might spoil his revenge plot. This moment shows growth from the Wanderer despite his flaws. And that is what I consider to be a damn good character flaw and good execution of said flaw within the story itself. Now that we've talked about good flaws in storytelling, what about the bad ones? The easiest to point out for me is the non-flaw being marketed as a flaw. This is where some characters can feel like they have no flaws even if the game tries to present one. I do have to make a disclaimer that for the 1000th time, I don't hate Mawika or Natlan. I genuinely don't. I pulled for Mawika. I really enjoyed the Archon quest. And while I have not completed exploring Natlan in the slightest. I have played some of its world quests and I do enjoy Natlan environmentally and in terms of like world building. Anyway, tangent aside, it's not like I can dissuade some people from saying that I hate Natlan just because I criticize it a lot. I've criticized Inazuma more than I have criticized Natlan. And I love Inazuma. It's my favorite region. It's the first region that I 100% completed. Anyway, tangent aside, for real, I do think Mawika is a good example where her character's flaw isn't an actual flaw. At least it's not executed well enough for it to be considered an actual flaw. Let me explain a bit. I can definitely buy that Mawika's flaw is her selflessness, but I also understand when some people say that this isn't an actual flaw and this doesn't make her a complex character by default. I still think that Genshin just fumbled the execution here because too much of anything, including selflessness, can 100% be a flaw. So in concept, that works, and that especially works for someone like Mawika who is hyper competent. She's too good at what she does, and therefore maybe people can never question her as a leader, and this makes her have blind spots in her own decisions, including thinking that sacrificing herself as much as possible can be a good thing. She definitely thinks that the only way to save Natlan and her people is to constantly sacrifice herself, even though it will hurt those around her. Mawika giving up her life as a human definitely upset her sister and the rest of her family, but her sister especially. She felt the loss of Mawika greatly, and when she was ready to give up her life once again at the end of the Natlan Archon quest, it shows how her selflessness is bordering on fatalism. But like I've said before in my Mawika video, this flaw of hers is just ridiculously underdeveloped. She's given an out from almost all of the conflicts that she faces in the game. Her decisions always turn out to be the best one, including the one she made 500 years ago to save Natlan and leaving her family to grieve her. And now 500 years later, she's also still making the right decision, so when she tries to sacrifice herself yet again, she does so in two different ways. The first one is sacrificing all of her precious belongings to save the traveler and everyone else. And then she also tried to give up her life again to save Natlan until she's given a way out by the captain, who, mind you, was the only character who seriously challenged Mawika's views as an Archon. But my point is, her flaws don't really impact the story as much as it should. If, let's say, her selflessness in giving up her own life ended up being worse for her family and the repercussions of that still haunts her centuries later, and her grief over that shows up in her decisions the same way it showed up in Ace, it would have actually been a real flaw. I'm not saying that Mawika has to be another dysfunctional and incompetent Archon to be interesting. I already think she's an interesting character. She's definitely different because the closest functioning Archon that we had before her was Zhongli pre-retirement and Nahida, who was imprisoned for 500 years. So having an Archon that's well adjusted, respected, and human makes her an already very interesting character for me in concept. It's just that she can come off as too perfect because the game story didn't really let her make mistakes, because believe it or not, even the most competent people can still make mistakes. And if you're saying like, oh, she's a god, so you can't expect her to make the same mistakes as human, but then she's also the Archon that is human. She's literally the only one that's human, I guess, if you don't count Farina. Now, the reason I even wanted to make this video was to talk about the next type of flaw that I think is actually bad for storytelling, and that is a flaw that exists for the sake of a gag. These are the things that I would consider can make some characters annoying, especially when they're given to characters with very little development or it's established poorly. Can you imagine if the game never really spent any time on A's actual flaws, like her inability to deal with grief, and only pushed the she can't cook flaw in our faces constantly? She would be kinda bad as a character. It would make her very one note. I'm not saying that we can't have funny quirks like A can't cook or Zhongli is bad with money, and most recently, Barca hates paperwork. Those can be really entertaining. In fact, they make characters memorable and lighthearted, and sometimes even endearing. However, it can become a problem when one flaw becomes a defining trait for these characters, or the defining trait. I've seen this play out in fandoms where a character's complexity and more nuanced flaws are essentially overshadowed by their more shallow ones. But Genshin itself is sometimes just guilty of this too. Genshin sometimes doubles down on this one shallow quirk or flaw, if you wanna call it, or a gag over and over again. Like I said, a lighthearted moment is fine, but the character character themselves should still be consistent with who they are at their core. What I mean by this is, for example, Zhongli. Despite having no concept of financial literacy, he shouldn't be portrayed as an airheaded old man for the sake of a gag. This contradicts who he is fundamentally as a character. He is the oldest Archon. He may not be the god of wisdom or anything, but he's still a wise character, someone whose life experience is unlike any other. He has guided Liyue for thousands of years, and therefore you cannot just reduce him to an idiot for the sake of a gag. I'm not saying that this is what they've done with Zhongli, I'm just giving an example of how messed up that would be. I personally think that they've done a pretty good job in making him the wise old god character while still having some light-heartedness in him, but I'm just using him as an example of how absurd it is to do that to a very nuanced character like Zhongli. Now, I can't say the same for Varka though. We get it, he doesn't like paperwork. And before I get into all that, I do think Varka is a great character. He's nuanced, he's meant to be nuanced. Just look at his character demo. In the game itself, especially in the story quest, he's portrayed as a selfless leader who is more than willing to sacrifice himself for the sake of Mondstadt. And I think his story quest is pretty good for what it is. So great, he's a cool character, he has a big heart, he cares for the people around him, and in turn, other people really care for him. He's admired by most of the people in Mondstadt. But then, what is his real flaw? Currently, Varka's biggest and most known flaw is that he doesn't like paperwork and is irresponsible. And it doesn't really help that the game plays into this gag so much as an attempt on humor, I guess. I think it's fine to have a joke about how Varka hates paperwork, but there is still a limit, and an overused joke will eventually just become stale. In the case of Mondstadt's most recent event, Varka's gag is, as usual, him avoiding paperwork. Who would have thought? But then, there was this one moment where Diluc, who mind you is the rare specimen in Mondstadt who doesn't like both alcohol and the Knights of Avonius, and he invited them for a celebratory drink. So it was a rare occasion, right? But then, Jean, being Jean, says she can't go because of work, and Varka tries to convince her to go, you know, like, Jean, take a break, you deserve a break, yada yada yada. And Jean doesn't actually say no. She says yes, as long as Varka would help her with paperwork after the party. And Varka just went, never mind, you can just do your work by yourself and then you come and join us. Why? I just like, why? Is that supposed to be funny? I'm just annoyed at this moment in particular because it makes Varka comes across as very inconsiderate when the game has repeatedly tried to show that he cares for others, including Jean, because she is someone who he appointed as acting Grandmaster. He knows the workload and responsibilities are astronomical. He's the Grandmaster. So the game is purposely framing Varka as 1, lazy, 2, inconsiderate, and 3, an asshole. And for what? The sake of a joke, for a gag that's been done like 500 times at that point? It's not the exact same thing, but the vibes and how the game is treating Varka in that moment, it reminds me of how Genshin treated A in her first story quest, where she had lighthearted moments and was just walking around in Inazuma with the Traveler after trying to kill them, and also the Vision Hunt Decree and basically everything else. Yes, that's a Shogun puppet, but A was aware, and the game was just like, wanna see A be adored and having snacks and taking photos? It's just inconsistent and out of place. And I'm not saying that they have to be serious all the time, but at the very least, make it consistent with the narrative, the ongoing story, and the characters, please. But anyway, back to Varka. So Varka knows Jean works too much. That is actually a well-known flaw that Jean has as a character. She's a workaholic. She doesn't know how to let loose. She doesn't seem like she can stop herself from working or delegate more efficiently. So when her colleagues and friends constantly tell her to relax and take some time off for herself, they're not wrong. This flaw of Jean is actually something believable, and I think it's a pretty interesting flaw for Jean to have. It's not story changing or anything, but it also provides enough friction on other characters. Not in a major way, but you can see the Mondstadt characters just worrying about about her. So seeing Jean being the workaholic that she is in that moment is a non-issue. The issue is that the game chose that exact moment to repeat the Varka hates paperwork gag. This gag would have landed fine had it been in a situation where it wouldn't make him sound so dismissive of Jean's exhaustion and workaholic tendencies. What pisses me off is that the game actually knows how to write the lazy, drunk uncle gag pretty okay with Venti. Like, I'm using him as an example again, but he has a similar running gag. He's lazy and he loves to drink, but I don't remember a time where Venti is just inconsiderate for the sake of a gag, especially towards beloved characters like Jean. Maybe I missed an interaction, so point that out to me if you do remember an example of Venti being inconsiderate because he's lazy and drunk on purpose like Varka was. But at the very least, Venti's gags never framed him as someone who acts like he cares for his people, and when he is in a position to actually help out those people like Jean, and Varka himself doesn't even have to actually do the paperwork for Jean or with her afterwards. He can just try to convince her more instead of just like, whoop, never mind. I will say, Jean herself is a grown woman and she does have bad habits when it comes to work, but I think she wasn't past persuasion, especially when the occasion itself is that rare. Remember, Luke hates both alcohol and the nights, so it is a very rare occasion. And before anyone here calls Varka a workplace toxic male, I genuinely don't agree with that. I think he does care for every single one of his knights, and Jean's workaholism can also be a toxic trait. I know I've seen this myself at work. It can 100% be a toxic trait to other people regardless of your gender, but it's just that the game tried to make a gag on both his and Jean's expense. And I repeat, same energy that they did with Lighthearted A in her first story quest, but it's also at her expense because it also framed her as someone without any accountability for her actions, even though that's clearly not the case. A is nuanced, she cares and everything, but it's just not shown in that particular moment. So my point is, flaws can be good, but some flaws, especially shallow ones that are poorly framed and executed, can actually ruin a character for some people rather than add complexity to them. Varka's flaw for me is that he can be irresponsible. Yes, he's brave and is selfless, but most of the time, he doesn't seem to have a clear plan on what to do. For his expedition, he took the best of the Knight of Favonius, and he genuinely just didn't have a clear plan on what he was gonna do. While this did end up going well in the story, it can still be a really concerning trait, especially since he was willing to sacrifice not only the lives of his knights, because going on an expedition without a concrete plan isn't actually the most responsible thing you can do, but he is also putting Mondstadt at risk because, you know, he's not there, he's the Grandmaster. Most of the knights, the best ones, are also not there. I mean, Mondstadt has Venti, but it did work out in the end, even though he was the knight destined to defeat the Valen when he terrorized Mondstadt. But the Traveler showed up while he was already on his expedition. He also has some good judgment in leaving Mondstadt in the hands of capable people. He clearly knows that Jean is capable of being acting Grandmaster. There are also other knights still present like Kea, Eula, Albedo, and Diluc is also there, and there's obviously Barbados who can step in if anything catastrophic were to happen when he was away. But it is still a risk that he gambled on. He obviously cares about what's happening in Mondstadt, even thinking about going back several times, but he as a character also seems to have decided that going on his expedition and dealing with the abyss up north is worth the risk of the lives of his knights and also his city's safety. That is what I personally think can potentially be Varka's more nuanced flaw, because it affects multiple other characters and also the story, but I don't think they've actually explored this side of him that much since he is a fairly new character and it does take a while to build up the good kind of flaws in the story. There's a reason why the most nuanced, flawed, and complex characters are the Archons, or characters who are just constantly present in the story. They just get more screen time to be established. So yeah, I'm not a big fan of GAGS being portrayed as a character's entire personality. Varka, despite being a prick in that scene, does do his paperwork though. He avoids them and he hates them, but it's not like he completely ignores it. Treating his laziness and drunken uncle gag as his entire character would be a disservice, especially with how much his story quest established. That would be like looking at Sino only as a nerd and ignoring everything he's ever done in the story and his role as the General Mahamatra. This is also something that I found interesting, but I personally think, again, this is my opinion, but I think the characters get the same amount of crap regardless of their gender, but for different reasons. So for example, I do think the female characters tend to be marketed by Genshin itself to be, at the very least, likable. And in order to make them more likable, the game tends to soften their edges quite a bit, which lead to the perception that they're boring or waifu bait, when in fact they do have complexities as characters that's just not highlighted in favor for more lighthearted moments, which does lean into certain tropes. Arlecchino is probably one of the more rough around the edges female characters that we have. She's ruthless, deeply complex, and very intriguing, and yet the game still also showers her with lighthearted moments, which can be entertaining, don't get me wrong, but these kinds of treatments from the game towards its own female characters can add to that oversimplification, and hence why they can come off as shallow or too perfect for the sake of being likable, when that's actually so far from the truth. We have flawed and complex female characters in the game, especially now. I would know, I criticized this years ago. The male characters are treated a bit differently. I feel the game gives them more flexibility to be unlikable. Their flaws are on full display most of the time, but flaws and overt aggression without nuance can come off as genuine unlikability, or more commonly falling into the edgelord trope. So the male characters also falls into tropes when their flaws aren't fully established, and if you like that trope, the edgelord trope, that's not a bad thing. Liking a trope isn't always a bad thing, and therefore a character being a trope isn't necessarily a bad thing either. For example, I really dislike Kitsune trope, so I really like Yaibiko, but I have seen some people dislike how cunning and dishonest she can be to the traveler, and I also really like the Wanderer, if you couldn't already tell. However, there's no denying that before his backstory, flaws, and nuances as a character, before the quests and multiple events established him as a character, he was basically an edgelord. He was very hostile towards the traveler, he had very edgy lines, even in Sumeru, where he was like the main antagonist, one of the main antagonists. He had that one line, "Let's recreate the Archon War" or something, thrown at Nahida of all people. If the game didn't give him actual nuanced flaws, he would probably just be another edgelord character. And since the game decided to add more nuance, even to this day, and seeing how his own redemption arc is still ongoing, leaving him as an edgelord would have been wasted potential. Even with all of that established, there are still plenty of people who can't see past his edgelord behavior. The same way some people still ignore the nuances that's given to A, Columbina, Furina, and many other female characters. So yeah, I personally think both male and female characters receive criticisms for how oversimplified they're presented sometimes by the game, and just the erasure of their nuances. It's just more visible in female characters because we just have more female characters compared to the male ones. In conclusion, I personally want complex and flawed characters. I think they add so much to the story narratively, but of course it will only have the desired effect if those characters' flaws are handled with care and with proper execution. Once a flaw is used as a gag, it will backfire and erase any kind of nuance that a character might have. I think lighthearted moments are fine as long as those moments stay true to who those characters are supposed to be. But that is all of my opinion. Let me know what you think and which character is your favorite in terms of their flaws and complexity. I'm bad at replying to comments, but I do read all of them, and I appreciate every single one of you for leaving comments and for just watching this video. And if you've made it this far, please consider subscribing if you haven't already. It would mean so much to me. I appreciate you all so much, and I will see you in the next one. Bye bye.